What did you make of the Bombers' performance in the loss at Tim Hortons on the weekend?
Head scratcher, right? Yeah. The Spidey senses for me weren't going so much because my story that I focused in on was looking at just how much better the Bombers have been than the Hamilton Tiger Cats on paper this season. I mean, the Bombers were number one in 21 of 24 major offensive categories that I had identified, and then they were number one or number two in 16 of 24 defensive categories. Hamilton wasn't better than sixth in any of them, and it just didn't, on paper it didn't make sense. But of course, even talking to players this week, last week, they all brought up the fact that they beat the crap out of Saskatchewan in the Banjo Bowl last year and then went into Hamilton and they got beaten, and that was their worst defeat of the year. This one to me is worse though, because they lost the Labor Day Classic. They lose in Saskatchewan. They come back to Winnipeg, have this incredible performance. I don't know if any of us have ever seen them play better. I don't know if any of them have ever played better themselves as a group. And yet they go into Hamilton and they're just not even close to the same. Not bad on offense at first, but then big mistakes in the second half. And the defense, which I had lauded in a story last week for just how they were flying under the radar, well, they did not have a good performance. So it is a head scratcher. And I do believe that the inconsistency that this team has shown this year is certainly something to keep an eye on and is possibly troublesome. They didn't lose 4 games last year. They didn't lose 4 games the year before. This year they've lost 4, 3 of them against teams below 500. Some of that just doesn't make sense.
And I mean, let's dive into those 4 games. They got absolutely steamrolled by the BC Lions at home earlier in the season. And the one common denominator from that game to the game on the weekend is no Jackson Jeffcoat. And I'll get you to talk about that in a minute as well, Ted. And then you had the bizarre comeback, the blown lead in Ottawa. And then the game against the Saskatchewan Roughriders, which also went to overtime. I'll say this. They came back against BC and showed who they were, laying it on them. The big games, they've played quite well. Obviously, the Labor Day Classic game went into overtime. I still think that moving forward, I think there's a little bit of a concentration and focus problem for a team going up against some of the lesser lights in the league, the way that they've played so far. But they have come up big against the big ones. And let's face it, they're going to need to do that in their next couple of games. But when you look at these, comparing that game to the other ones, does this one stand out as just a pure lack of focus? And can you tie that into the second half against Ottawa and the way they prepared going into the first game against BC?
Huss, honestly, I'd shake my head on all of that line of thinking because I just can't see how a Mike O'Shea team is going to be lacking focus. And when you talk about Adam Bighill and Willie Jefferson and Zach Collaros and Nick Dembski and all those old linemen and Brandon Alexander and all those guys, when do those guys ever lose focus? We just haven't seen that. So I would be a bit surprised if it really was a focus issue in this case. I think we do have to give some credit to Hamilton. I thought the Hamilton Tiger Cats played a great football game in all 3 phases. They certainly were the better team in that game. And I'm not so sure that you can't, I think Zach Collaros forced a couple of passes that led to interceptions in the second half last week. But other than that, I just thought Hamilton was making really good plays, and they kept the Bombers at bay, which is not an easy thing to do, as the Saskatchewan Roughriders found out, giving up points on 9 straight drives. Well, Hamilton had a better game plan. They executed it very well, and they got the win. I don't know 100% in my mind. I think it's easy to point at it and say that it's a lack of focus, but I'm not 100% sure that's the case. And I also think you can look at Labor Day and you can say, well, Labor Day is one of these games that's a toss-up. Even if I think the Bombers once went in there at 11-1, and the Riders were 1-11, and guess who won? The Riders. It's just there's something that they have in their building that allows them to be successful against Winnipeg in those Labor Day games. Not making any excuses here, because the peaks and valleys, and Drew Wolotarski talked about it last week, are more noticeable this year with this Bomber team than they were in previous years. And I'll tell you one thing the Bombers did not do often in the last couple of years was lose to teams that were really below them in the standings. You know, they might lose to a team that's right there with them, that kind of thing. But to lose 3 games to teams below 500 is, to me, very shocking. The Ottawa Redblacks can't win. They can't even protect a huge lead. They lose in BC this weekend, and yet they're the ones that came back and beat the Bombers. Again, we were scratching our heads at the beginning of this thing, and I scratched my head to explain how this has developed. And I'm not going to forget for a second that the Bombers are still 10-4. They've still come back like gangbusters every single time they've lost a game. And watch out for the next team that has to face them. In this case, it's going to be the 11-1 Toronto Argos. But there's something different with this team this year, and I think everybody can see it.
The only thing that's not different is the exact same thing happened last year after the Banjo Bowl against Hamilton, heading into the bye week. I believe 2 of their 3 losses were kind of like, what the heck just happened heading into the bye week. And really, I mean, we'll put the Labor Day game in sort of a category of its own, but they didn't seem to be focused the way they normally are or ready to play against BC. They didn't seem it yesterday or Saturday against the Hamilton Tiger Cats. And they completely lost their focus in the second half of that Ottawa game, playing like the game was over before it was over. Like, when the Bombers are dialed in, they're really hard to beat. I think they just haven't been dialed in the way we have come to expect. And let's face it, credit to them. They've set the bar very, very high, and expectations have followed. But that just didn't seem like a regular Bomber performance on Saturday for the most part.
No, it really didn't. And of course, some of that goes to the other team playing well. But, Zach Collaros has 13 interceptions this year. That ties his career high. He's still got 4 games left. There's things about even his season. And I mean, there's still a lot of talk about him being the MOP of this league. But every time that an interception, like, 3 interception game or 2 pick 6 game, he's had one of those this year. Things like that. 3, I think, what did he have? 4 pick 6s over 3 games or 4 games. These are things that are going to affect the voters. And it does make you wonder, is Zach just not quite at the peak that he has been in years past? But then he goes out against Saskatchewan and he threw 5 touchdown passes, which is a career high in the first half. I mean, they were just absolutely perfect, on point. The Bombers all talked about it, about how he made an inspiring speech after the Saskatchewan game and how he came in completely dialed in. And yet there they are a week later. And I guess if the bar is absolute perfect dialed in focus, there's no question the Bombers did not have that in the Hamilton game. And if you talk about peaks and valleys, there was no question there was going to be a valley this week, even if the Bombers played well, because there's no way they were going to play as well as they did in that Saskatchewan game. So it does create some uncertainty in the fan base. I think for the league, I think the whole league is loving it. I got to tell you, you read Twitter and you talk to colleagues out in other markets, and we're kind of sick of Winnipeg. It's pretty nice to see them coming back to earth every so often. But one thing we haven't even talked about yet is how, in my mind, that game was extremely costly against Hamilton, because now you face Toronto and then you face BC, and that BC game will almost certainly be for first place in the West. And it's in Vancouver. The Lions are playing pretty well, coming off another huge comeback win against Ottawa. And Toronto has barely lost to anybody. They lost 1 game to Calgary, which almost looked like an anomaly because they came right back and played great every game after that. To lose to Hamilton, a below 500 team, go on the bye, and then have to face the 2 best teams in the league, that is not an ideal situation.
The funny thing is I feel a lot more confident about the Bombers playing at home against a team like Toronto, or going on the road for a game that will determine the West Division against a team like BC, than a game like Saturday, where, they're sort of expected to win, but maybe a bit. Let's talk about Jackson
Jeffcoat. I mean, they haven't won there since 2017, except in the Grey Cup.
Yeah, no, that was an important game. I will say that. If they were going to win one, let it be that one. But, Ted, I was having the same conversations with some friends after watching the game that we were after the BC massacre earlier this season. Good Lord, you notice the lack of Jackson Jeffcoat. Maybe not play after play, and maybe not necessarily in the stats, but the presence that he has on that side of the football seems to open up a lot for Willie Jefferson, for other players in the middle. And I know they said they were just taking it easy. Like if that game had been a playoff game, I'm sure he plays. But you'll hope it's worth it because he was definitely missed. And I'm not saying they win the game if Jackson Jeffcoat's there, but I do think that, the ease of which Hamilton had throwing the football, moving the chains throughout the afternoon and putting it in the end zone, I think it's significantly depleted if 94 is out there.
I don't think there's any question, Huss, that you're right. I mean, I just think that Jackson Jeffcoat is a real difference maker, and it's a big – like Celestin Haba's a rookie. He's a good player, but he's new to the CFL, and he hadn't played in weeks. He probably hadn't played in 6, 7, 8 weeks. And then he goes back in there, and I don't think he had a particularly great game. Willie Jefferson, sorry to say it, Willie, but he was invisible in this game, really. Didn't show up on the stat sheet at all. The Bombers didn't get the kind of pressure they needed to get on Taylor Powell, who, as a rookie, a true rookie in this league, you should be able to rattle a guy like that. Well, they didn't even really get close to him to rattle him. Yeah, a couple of sacks, but not enough pressure on the plays where he was able to throw. And I thought the defensive backs played way too soft in their coverage, and Mike O'Shea seemed to agree entirely with that. There was a couple of times where, guys were 5 yards off. Yeah, they're keeping them in front of them, making a good play, but, making a safe play. But the Ticats were able to move the ball down the field pretty efficiently, and they certainly ran the ball well, better than the Bombers did. So I just don't think I don't think that defense was on point. And, an easy thing to point to explain why is because Jackson Jeffcoat wasn't out there, and it just wasn't at its premium level, because things really do start with that defensive line on this team. When they're getting the pressure, the Bombers have the best defensive backs in the league. There's no doubt about
it. And then to compound it all, what Ottawa did to the Bombers, BC did to Ottawa. That was an absolutely bananas comeback, one that absolutely should not have happened. But what a huge win by BC. And the West is back on officially. And listen, for everyone that wanted a playoff feel for October 6th, I think they're going to get it regardless of what happens in the next 2 weeks.
Absolutely. And, us, like you and I and everyone else who is involved in Manitoba football over the years, we all like Bobby Dice. We all care for Bobby Dice. We don't want to see Bobby Dice not succeed there with the Ottawa Red Blacks, but what a tough situation for him in that game. I'm sure he was up all night thinking about why they went for a field goal that allowed the BC Lions to return all the way to for a touchdown to win. And or to get back in the game and then eventually win. You got to trust your kicker. You think you can make a 47-yarder, and you can make a 47-yarder. But if you miss, it's just so risky. I just think if they punt there, they probably win the game. And I really, you've got better coverage out there with a punt, right? You don't have very good coverage guys out there on a field goal because you're expecting to make it. And it just seemed like that kind of mistake is the kind of thing that happens when you're having a 3-11 season. And it should have been a win for Ottawa. They should have salted away easily. They had so many chances to do it, and they just could not move the ball when they needed to, couldn't get that field goal when they needed it. And the Lions made them pay. And good on the Lions, because they've been an exciting team to watch the last couple of seasons. And it wasn't just all about Nathan Rourke, clearly, because Vernon Adams, though he throws a ton of interceptions as well, certainly can sling the ball, and he's been entertaining, and Lucky Whitehead's there and very entertaining. And I think it should come down to just a fantastic game in BC on October 6th with so much on the line. And with the Bombers playing Toronto next week, I still kind of expect the Bombers to come out and get a win there, playing at home. Haven't lost 2 games in a row in a long time. Seem to redouble their focus after losses, all those kinds of things. But if they were to lose, could be big-time advantage BC with that game being in their barn.
Well, the funny thing is, though, with 4 losses already on BC's card, even if the Bombers come in at 10-5, if they beat BC, they'll have the division. Like, this is an almost win and you win the division as long as you take care of business. There will be a couple more games Bombers have Edmonton and Calgary after that. Not sure what BC has, but
watch out for Edmonton, though, man. Like, I mean, that is not going to be an easy game. I don't think anyone in the league believes that Edmonton is an easy team anymore. In fact, if there were a few more games on the schedule, I think they would be a risk to make some noise in the playoffs. I think Hamilton's win this past week, really kind of messes with that possibility. But, Saskatchewan hasn't played great either. So that will not be an easy game for the Bombers, no matter what happens.